Hurricane Katrina, a historical retrospective. New Orleans, a city of nearly 400,000 people, known for its vibrant nightlife, unique music scene, and its spicy cuisine. And although its reputation is accurate, it doesn't present the whole history of this city. It's been 15 years since Hurricane Katrina, one of the worst natural disasters that this country has ever faced. A flood so impressive that by the end, almost 80% of the city was underwater, and over 1,500 people had died. But what has now become clear as the years have passed is that the damage of Hurricane Katrina cannot be attributed to nature alone. It wasn't just some freak storm whose power and ferocity were off the charts that devastated the town of New Orleans. It was a combination of overlooked systemic racism and complete and utter bureaucratic failure at every level that would end up amplifying the already devastating effects of this country-changing storm. And although the landfall of the storm is often the primary subject of conversation surrounding Hurricane Katrina, it doesn't tell the whole story, because most of the aspects of Hurricane Katrina that made it as devastating as it was started way before this storm even developed. To begin, New Orleans isn't really a city. In many ways, it could be considered a very livable swamp. During the original construction of what would become New Orleans, there wasn't a lot of good land, and by good land, I mean land above sea level. So when all that was used up, developers began to drain the swamps that surrounded the area. While not a bad idea if you're trying to expand the city, the consequences, as we'll see later, had dire implications. The first problem they faced when draining the swamp was the concept of subsidence, where the land continues to settle or sink lower over time. So if you drain a swamp and place a bunch of buildings on it, the ground will continue to sink lower and lower, to the point at which, on average, New Orleans is about 6 feet under sea level. Next, you began to face the issues of historical racial segregation in the town. Major public housing projects have since the early beginning been segregated, and New Orleans was no different. These projects cut across integrated communities that had a thriving life, and while these integrated communities had been available during the Second World War, after the war's end, these communities were no longer an option. Funding for public housing would go towards expanding existing projects, and those integrated communities increasingly became white suburbs. Now, this is a pretty standard story for a lot of cities across the United States. However, the story of New Orleans gets a bit more interesting. Now, if you take a look at this graphic, you can see which areas of New Orleans are above sea level and which are not. The areas that are bright green are above sea level, and the white is below sea level. Now, if you compare this image with a poverty map of New Orleans, you begin to make a frightening, although not too surprising, realization. Just in case you can't read the graph, the key shows the darker the purple, the poorer the area. The darkest purple are regions in which over 40% of the region is poorer than the federal poverty threshold. I've circled 2 regions to pay particular attention to. These regions, if you compare with the previous slide, are areas that lie below sea level. This information, while not necessarily shocking, shows a much deeper issue at heart here. The poorest regions of New Orleans are the most vulnerable. The richer areas are above sea level, and the poor are below sea level. However, while this may not be fair in any sense, the situation worsens again when you compare the previous 2 maps to a map of the concentration of African Americans in New Orleans. I've highlighted the same 2 regions, and as you can see, some of the darkest regions of the map, meaning the highest percentage of African Americans out of that given area, are contained in the same high-risk, low socioeconomic status areas. One of the first of many examples of the blatant eco-racism present in this disaster. Minorities and those in the lowest socioeconomic brackets are placed in the most vulnerable environments. I will make one more quick point about the vulnerability of New Orleans before the landing of Hurricane Katrina, and that is the natural barriers. Some of the best defense against coastal storms is not man-made. In fact, it is the wetlands and barrier islands that are crucial to breaking the storm as it approaches, lowering a storm surge's impact drastically, often by a matter of inches or feet, depending on how much wetlands and how many barrier islands there are. Now, I'm sure that inches or feet doesn't sound like a lot, but in many cases, a couple of inches can be the difference between a drowned city and a dry one. However, as advantageous as these areas can be, they have significantly reduced in the last couple of years. This is due once again to human influence. The creation of dams prevents the outflow of sediment from the rivers in this area. This outflow of sediment is crucial to replenishing the islands and wetlands, and without that replenishment, they simply fade away. As you can see in the overhead picture on the slide, over the course of a 4-year period, the wetlands and islands have reduced significantly. However, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. The date is August 23rd, 2005, and Hurricane Katrina is no more than a tropical depression forming over the Bahamas. However, as this depression continued on its determined westward path, it would pick up speed, and by the time it made its first landfall on the Florida coast on August 25th, it would be a Category 1 hurricane. But as it crossed into the warm waters of the Gulf, it would pick up speed drastically and would soon be labeled a Category 5 hurricane with wind speeds up to 175 miles per hour. Luckily enough for the citizens of New Orleans, the storm would lower in ranking to Category 3 before it made landfall in southeast Louisiana. And it would be here that the storm would test its strength against the defenses of an unsuspecting city. At the time, Mayor Roy Nagin was watching Katrina with interest, and although he had full faith in the city's defenses, he, along with the state's governor, Kathleen Blanco, had decided that Katrina was going to be a storm like no other, and it was time to order the evacuation of the city. He announced the mandatory evacuation on August 27th, a day before the storm would come crashing down on the city. And although New Orleans had established and refined an entire counterflow system of evacuation after experiences with previous hurricanes like Hurricane Ivan in 2004, evacuation came too late for some. Take a look at the graph on the screen and think back to what the other charts have shown. The areas with the lowest socioeconomic level, the areas with the highest minority population, the areas most at risk because the sea level their buildings are at, also have some of the lowest access to transportation out of the city. And if you don't have your own car or have enough cash on hand to get right out of the city or to rent a hotel what are you supposed to do other than stay? The city had originally planned to have city buses take those without the means to leave out of the city. But worried about all the traffic out of the city, the local government just decided to instead to bus people to the Superdome and Convention Center. And when enough traffic had passed, the people would be bused further out of the city. This decision, although maybe smart in the moment, would be costly later on. The situation also shows once again just how hard it was to handle a disaster like this if you are of a lower socioeconomic class. You are put in a more vulnerable area and yet don't have the means to combat that vulnerability, once again showing the side effects of eco-racism. The issues with evacuation were already hard, and all the while the levees that surround the city were failing. 52 levees had some kind of catastrophic failure, whether a hole broke in them or it was pushed over by the force of the water. Whatever the reason, the city was now rapidly filling with torrents of water, with areas of the city being under almost 10 feet of water, if not more. Hundreds of citizens were stranded in their attics as the water trapped them in, not knowing if or when the water would stop rising. This wasn't just an intense storm surge. It was the complete failure of the New Orleans safety net. This complete failure of city safety, along with poor planning and evacuation plans, put hundreds more at risk. One particular example comes to mind, the St. Rita's nursing home. They had originally chosen not to evacuate, worrying that without proper evacuation out of the city, many of the senior citizens would die, stranded at the Superdome or Convention Center without proper medical attention. But they were not planning on the levees breaking. Although the workers at the home attempted to get as many as they could, the water quickly filled the nursing home, killing 35 of the residents right in their beds and wheelchairs. But this brings up the all too crucial question: why did the levees fail? If a city relies on them to prevent disasters like this, shouldn't they be checked for problems and strength tested regularly? This question caused a lot of contention across the country as authority figures at various levels passed the blame of the faulty levees around. The prevailing theory placed the blame on the New Orleans Levee Board, a local council, who were blamed of corruption and negligence of the levee's maintenance. This theory took the country by storm, as stores of misinformation surrounding the disaster continued to flourish, twisting the story as people stuck in New Orleans still suffered. And this is how it would have been remembered if it had not been for the continual work of Sandy Rosenthal, author of Words Whispered in Water and founder of levees.org. Through her hard work, it was discovered that it was the New Orleans Levee Board's most adamant accuser, the Army Corps, who were responsible for the complete failure of the levees. Sandy single-handedly started a movement to find the truth of what happened to the levees, not accepting the theory that it was local officials and New Orleans citizens who were to blame. The levees that failed during Hurricane Katrina were a federal responsibility. Built and maintained by the Army Corps, the failure was completely theirs. The levee's failure comes down to a simple oversight during a crucial stress test, 18 years earlier when the levees were originally contracted to be built. But to understand the failure of this test, we must understand the structure of the levees themselves. Essentially, these levees are built pretty simply. It is a concrete wall that is braced by steel pilings that are driven deep into the earth underneath them to brace against a storm surge. If they had been built correctly, water would have only topped over the levee, resulting in some flooding, but not very much, as soon the water would flow below the levee wall. But if the levee is to break or fall over, then you have a serious problem. Now, if you were to build these levees properly by the book, the pilings are supposed to be buried 42 feet deep to meet the strength requirements that were necessary to protect the city. But that would be very expensive, so in an attempt to save a bit of money, the Army Corps did an experiment. They built a section of levee to put in a practice situation, with the pilings only 16 feet deep. Then they put it against a test storm surge, and it seemed that levees had held with no issue. But what the engineers did not see was that the entire levee had begun to tilt as a result of the force of the water. They overlooked this because it was hidden underneath a tarp. So the Army Corps went ahead and built the levees with the pilings only 16 feet deep, and they saved about $100 million doing so. But when the time came and a proper storm surge was faced, the levees began to tilt, and as they tilted, water rushed into the crack produced by the levee and loosened it from its positioning until finally the levee succumbed and fell over if it hadn't broken already. They traded $100 million for almost $161 billion in damages caused by Hurricane Katrina. This high damage price also comes as a result of another major factor. The federal response to this disaster was highly publicized, and for good reason. To speak bluntly, it was an absolute mess. One of the most embarrassing responses to a disaster that our country had ever seen. There were tens of thousands of people stranded in New Orleans, at the Convention Center, at the Superdome, all suffering with little to no supplies. You had senior citizens, newborns, hospital patients simply living in the New Orleans sun at full exposure, and many died as a result. The National Guard wasn't activated until September 1st, 3 days after Katrina had made landfall, and by this point, it was already too late. Plenty had died, either from exposure, dehydration, starvation, or just being stuck in their home without people out looking for them. Renee Martin could have been one of these people. Sick at the time of the hurricane's landing, she called emergency responders, letting them know that she would not be able to leave her home by her own strength. But they didn't come for her. She would have died if not for a stranger. The stranger took her on his boat to the overcrowded Superdome, and she watched as the Superdome devolved into chaos, as the panic set in. The panic at the Superdome, the national confusion and frustration, all began to illustrate another key point of this disaster: toxic uncertainty. Locals don't know who to turn to. Who's in charge? Who's coming to help us? Who's to blame? These questions and local confusion be reinforced by the disorganization of several government agency responses. FEMA was designed to deal with issues like this, and when the time came for it to take charge, it failed. However, FEMA's failure here doesn't entirely lie with its leadership or actions during Katrina. It starts much earlier than that. If we compare the response from 9/11 to Katrina, it's hard to believe it's the same agency. FEMA's response may have not been flawless, but it was effective. As soon as the disaster struck in New York, FEMA was there, organizing and bringing aid to those who needed it. They took charge and saved lives. But in Katrina, they took a back seat, claiming they didn't have the authority or the power to bring aid into New Orleans, that they weren't in charge. And so you may be asking, how could this have happened? How could this agency flipped so dramatically? Well, it boils down to one single event: the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, a collection of 22 federal agencies that now all had to work together. And with agencies like immigration and TSA taking a large portion of the budget, how is a small agency like FEMA supposed to operate? Because of its inclusion in this department, FEMA lost almost $80 million from its budget to be used in other areas of Homeland Security. This extra layer of bureaucracy eliminated a large portion of FEMA's resources and effectively hamstringing FEMA's response. By removing the agency in charge of this kind of event, the entire system struggled to get anything done during Katrina, feeding into the uncertainty and frustration that already surrounded the event. People knew different things, had different authorizations, but weren't able to organize to get things done until hundreds died. So to conclude, New Orleans city planning and housing put minorities and people at the lowest socioeconomic level in the most vulnerable position, both in terms of their physical housing being below sea level and at the most risk, but also ordering evacuation too late and with not enough city support to get those out who couldn't afford to. The Army Corps' attempts to cut corners and save money on the levees exponentially worsened the effects of Hurricane Katrina. Without the levee failure, New Orleans would have been in a much better position and hundreds of lives would have been saved. And their attempts to shift the blame to the New Orleans Levee Board was almost criminal. Federal response to the disaster was delayed to the minimization of FEMA and to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It was not the same FEMA that responded to Hurricane Katrina. Their powers were limited and role unknown, and as a result, their response was disorganized and frustrating. This disaster will continue to live in our history as one of the worst natural disasters our country has ever seen, and along with its price tag and death toll, it also illustrated the faults in our government's emergency response and showed the world that maybe preventative measures are worth the price.